Hey there, how are we doing? Thanks for coming to this video. Now this is going to be on an example of a literature review, and I know so many people have been screaming out for seeing actual samples of how we do these things. It's only sometimes we really get a grasp of it when we see it out in front of us and know how somebody else has constructed it. So I've got here a literature review where I'm going to go through today. You'll see the example as I give commentary, and hopefully by the end of it you'll have a much better idea about what constitutes a literature review. So remember, a literature review should be critically engaging and evaluating and positioning and justifying the research of the dissertation in terms of the surrounding literature that supports this actual dissertation happening. So here we have the title, Gendered Identity and Discourse of Leadership. So if this is the actual title in the literature review, we'll be looking for the exploration of some of these key themes that we can identify, including gender, identity, aspects of discourse, and also leadership. This is the outline of the dissertation that was in the contents page. So here we have the review of literature. It has an introduction. This is an important component part of a literature review. First of all, you should give an outline about what is going to be said in the review, an overview of each of the different sections and themes, just like you would in an essay. It's just for the reader to signal to them what is to come. And then we can see here, we've also got identity, we've then got gendered leadership, communication and discourse, and then specifically they're going to be focusing on metaphors. So we can see some of this thematic organization that is going on and being structured. It looks in the beginnings then that it has a good structure, yeah, and we can see how it's going to get narrowed down from some of the more wider scoping of identity and gendering to more specific things to do with the discourse and aspects of discourse itself, looking at metaphors in this instance. I've copied down perhaps some of the criteria you might be looking at in terms of marking it or evaluating what a good dissertation literature review is. So here we've got high, to have extensive literature considered and critically analysed, integrated to clearly support the full critical evaluation of the topic. There is critical content relating to evaluation of prior empirical work or theory. Now, a middling sort of criteria to judge a literature review might be looking at sufficient literature considered, some attempts at analysis, but lacking in critical focus. And then for a failing, literature review just might not be present, or the literature review is irrelevant and it's erroneous and it doesn't relate to the research objectives. We don't want that happening. And I'm sure many of you will not be doing that. So now I'm actually going to roll through and scroll through the actual review of the literature. So here we have then, first of all, the introduction. So here the student has first started to talk about the different areas and different thematic organisation of the literature review. So they're clearly identifying and signposting what they might be. They've done this at the beginning. Then all they're really doing in the whole of this section is gradually going through an outline about what is to come in the following literature review. They refer to some different theories. They've got some nice kind of structuring keywords and conjunctive adverbs here in kind of furthermore. And then they're going through firstly, secondly, thirdly, and they're going to describe what is in the literature review. So, you know, no great showmanship in the introduction. It's just performing a rudimentary, perfunctory task of just outlining what is to follow. Simples. Now then, we're also going to think about these various sections that we're going to go through. So the first key section is on identity. So perhaps the broadest top end of the pyramid, where it's then going to funnel down. So identity is the broad church about what this dissertation is about. It's going to funnel down from things like identity into genderization, and then also into things like discourse and metaphors. So just looking at it before we get into what some of this meaning is, what you really want to see, if you just stand back and look at this on your screen, we can see that there's a good distribution of sources and academic content. Just looking at the page, we can see how they appear across the page here, furthermore joining and progressing the paragraphs as it goes along. So what it's ultimately doing then is giving a good outline about what identity is. This dissertation relates to the field of management and organisations, and therefore a lot of the literature is being drawn from there. It's looking at various theories and trying to ground and give an understanding and a positioning about the sense of identity that this dissertation is going to carry forward. As we go further down into this paragraph on identity, we can see this progression and this discussion. We can see how it links and move over. We've got nice discussion about however moments here where they're disagreeing with the literature and they're showing this development. They're not just describing the literature on identity that is relevant for the dissertation, but they're actually sorting through it. They're looking at it in a refined way, and they're showing comparisons and differences. This carries on into this section here as they move forward. They're still kind of bringing together, showing relationships. What is also strong here is how they focus this to say where there might be a gap in the literature regarding identity and leadership. I think this section's really good because what it's doing is really propping up and supporting the construction and the need and the reasoning for this dissertation. As we read it through, there's lots of therefores, and they're giving rise to justification for why this research should be carried out, the why questions. As we go down further then, this kind of construction and looking at identity has funneled down into particularly focusing on gendered aspects of identity relating to leadership. I think what they do well also is that they kind of take a position on here. So behind all this and study of the literature, there's a certain approach. They're approaching it from a certain perspective about how gender is constructed in leadership. And this relates well to the overall understanding of the dissertation and positioning of it in terms of looking at discourse. Therefore, it's helpful if the literature starts to come to terms with a postmodern approach. Moving on to the next part of the literature review, as we come down, we can see now it has a full section dedicated to the gendered notions of leadership. Again, before we get into it, we can see again that there's a nice distribution of sources, which kind of says that there's been a dialogue being drawn between different studies. There's relationships, progression, movement across that, which is really important. This student is having a conversation, having a debate with the literature as they go through and look at this notion of gendered leadership. We can also see how the paragraphs are structured. Here, they've turned to a section on an important aspect of leadership is the followers. Okay, so they're looking at the relationship between followers and also gendered identity. They've also shown in this section that they're not just looking at gender from a feminist perspective, but they're also looking at the masculine aspects of leadership. This is really good to see. But on the whole, as somebody who's appraising it, what I'm happy to see is the level of scholarship, the amount of sources, and the discussion and the laying the foundations of a particular approach and position that the dissertation wants to argue. Okay, so we've now moved on and progressed to communication and discourse. So in this section, the person is going to be reviewing aspects of communication in relation to leadership. So as we go through, we can see that they've done that. And this continues into this section. We can see that the student is carving out positions relating to different theories, which are going to allow them to move on to the methodology later. And also in the analysis, they'll be able to return to this literature to allow discussion and exploration of their analysis. As we progress through and move further down, they've moved on to other areas of identity in relation to discourse, and there's excellent discussion throughout this paragraph. The sentence flow is really good. I can't see any mistakes. The presentation is really good. So the student has proofread it to a really high standard. It's really easy to follow and the flow of it is excellent. I think a good thing, we can see how in this last paragraph here, what the student has done is they're not just reviewing theory and literature in an abstract way, describing it like it's detached from the actual research and the position of what this research is going to do. You can see how they're relating it in this section to their own research. However, due to the amount of literature assessing the topic of gender discourse and acknowledging issues such as a gender divided in language, However, due to the amount of literature assessing the topic of gender discourse and acknowledging issues such as a gender divide in language and discursive misunderstandings as a result of gender, the dissertation wishes to examine how leaders themselves experience this gendered influence and divide in practice. So I think it's really nice how they're drawing that connection, they're making the theory and the positioning that they've discussed in the literature review substantiate and support the direction of the dissertation. Finally then, we've come to this section on metaphors. So again, this final pinpoint of narrowing it down to a more specific aspects of discourse relating to gendered leadership that the student wishes to look at. They're using metaphors and discussing that as a discursive tool of the imagery. So this is a really interesting part. And then they're talking about how this relates to power in terms of leadership and gender. What this section does, which I can't show you now, but it later lays the foundations for a particular methodology that follows in terms of using visual methods. And this student actually got participants to draw or to sculpt their understanding, their gendered notions about what leadership is, using visual methods of images to try and encapsulate and communicate their inner thoughts and their conceptions of how leadership is represented. So it's nice to have that connection between aspects of the literature review and the method. So within this section, there's lots of critical notions and taking apart about gender and leadership, and then using it and focusing in on the tool of metaphors. Okay, so that's an overview of this literature review, and hopefully you've been able to pause it at certain times and stop and think about what I've been saying and read some of this literature review. Some of the real positives of it, I think it's a really good structure. It starts off with that essential introduction, laying out the outline about what is to follow in the literature review. It has this dynamic of starting off with a broader concepts of looking at gender and leadership, and then it drills down and starts to hone it into thinking about aspects of discourse, and in particular metaphors that the dissertation wants to examine and look at. It's very critical. It has really good analysis. You can see from the conjunctive adverbs, the moreovers, the therefores, the similarities which are used, that they're not just describing this, they're actually finding antagonisms, finding points of conflict in the literature, or extensions of thought, connections between different bodies of literature. Also, I think something that's really good is behind all this, they are approaching the literature review with a position, and it's written from a certain perspective, from a postmodernist perspective of how they want to understand leadership, gendering, and also discourse. So it's doing multiple things. It's not just describing theory, and it's not just going through literature. It's actually doing the work of positioning the dissertation from different perspectives. And this is a really high-end thing to do. So if we were to move back up to what we would be thinking about in terms of how we might mark this or judge it, it's going to flick back up to the marking criteria. You know, does it deserve to be in high, middle, or failing? So, you know, it's certainly much more than a fail. And if we look at the criteria of a middle, sufficient literature considered, some attempt at analysis, but lacking in critical focus. I'd certainly be wanting to put this into a caliber of a high category because it's extensive, it's been considered critically, the literature is integrated clearly to support the evaluation of the topic of gendered leadership, and also there's evaluation of the empirical work and the theories and studies which have gone on before. So it's a really good piece of work. Okay, that's it for this overview. I hope you've got something from this example of a literature review. I always find it so helpful when you can see how somebody else has done it and how they put it together. So good luck with doing your literature reviews. I hope you put together and piece together a really good, rigorous and analytical review of your literature. Bye for now, take care, see you later.